If you watch videos like this one about photography on YouTube, or you read articles, or just see people discussing it, you're probably familiar with the magic of medium format. People will praise it, saying that it's special, or they'll use words like the medium format look when it comes to images. Now, the truth is, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of this stuff. I actually think most of the time it's just justification to spend more money on gear, and it's something that I don't really buy into when people talk about Hasselblad's color science, or that the Leica camera just has images that are gonna look better than anything else you take, or this or that, depending on the brand. And actually, I used to own a Hasselblad X2D earlier this year that I ended up selling because I put it to the test and I never really got that feeling from it. And then recently I was borrowing the Fujifilm GFX100S II, thanks again to Fujifilm, and the first images I took on that camera, well, it made everything I just told you up in the air. I questioned everything about my skepticism because the first images I got from that particular camera were incredible. We just went on a bike ride the day I got it. I just brought it with me to take some sample images just to see what I was working with. And I came back and I reviewed those images while I was in bed. And I looked at Sophie and I go, well, this is a problem. This is not good. And she goes, huh, what's wrong? And I'm like, look at these images. How incredible are these images straight out of camera? No editing. And I was like, I just got to go add this camera to my cart right now. Like, I was just blown away by these images straight out of camera. Now, disclaimer, they are using a recipe, so they're not technically what many of you or some of you in the comments will define as no editing. But to me, these were right out of the camera. And I was very impressed. To the point where I was like, okay, I got to go. Am I going to have to buy this camera? I can't afford this thing. But I remained skeptical and I decided to make this video. We are going to be putting that to the test. Were the images out of that camera just the magic of medium format, or was it more like Mother Nature, or just something about that moment that just had really special light? I thought the best way to put this to the test was actually compare the GFX100S II to its fellow Fujifilm camera, the X100S, which has completely different sensor technology and it's a different sensor size, but can we get the same look and feel out of both of those cameras at the same time? And for fun, in this first test, I actually also threw in the Nikon ZF, which is a full frame camera that's obviously not Fujifilm. I tried to actually go back to the same exact spot I took those images of the GFX100S II at the beginning of the video, but there were some people fishing there, so I couldn't really use that spot. So I went to a equivalent spot that's not far from it. But the thing to keep in mind here is that we have the Nikon image, we have the Fujifilm X100S image, and the GFX image. The thing is, I shot all of these straight out of camera JPEG. Now, I do have a couple RAWs that we will take a look at, but for the most part, I'm using recipes and film simulations in this comparison because that's really what I care about. And that's a big disclaimer for this video. If you're here to learn about how good or bad medium format is, the truth is it's the best sensor under $10,000 in terms of specs or detail, or it's got the highest dynamic range, it's got the most megapixels, it's got the best sharpness. If that's something that's important to you, then it's probably the sensor for you. But for me, a lot of the times, I don't need a lot of that stuff. And I'd rather care about what comes out of the camera, or the looks and vibes. I can't believe I just said vibes, but the feeling that comes out of the images from the camera, or if something magical is happening, like we started off the video. And I'm also gonna show you a few other images that I took while at Mount Rainier between both of the Fujifilm cameras. Now, the reason I compared these two is because of the film simulations being both Fujifilm, that they've calibrated both of those sensors to look very similar when applying those particular film recipes, or sorry, film simulations, which in turn means the film recipes should look very similar. So if we take a look at these three images, the very first one we're gonna look at is at f11. Now, I'm gonna talk about aperture and setting aperture for medium format versus full frame or APS-C, but I wanna show you a couple of the images first, just to give you an idea or let you soak in and think which one looks the best to you, or that might have that medium format look. Now, the thing is, you're gonna notice in these that they're not that far off, especially when they're this small. So let's just take a look at each image individually. And also, I should note that the Nikon was shot at 40mm rather than 35 because that's the lens I had. But for the most part, I just stepped up and moved back. Again, not a scientific test. A lot of this is just about what do the images look like or feel like straight out of camera. And I really wanted to test that to see if I could save $7,000 or not. So in this first test, all f11, and you're gonna notice off the bat that if I zoom in here and we go to our comparison view, On the left, we have the X100S, and on the right, we have the GFX100S II. You're gonna see on the X100S, because it's that smallest sensor, that all of the background is in pretty high detail. Something else to note here is you're gonna notice a lot of grain on the X100S image. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't have grain turned on the GFX100S. It's just that the grain renders much different on the X100S than it did on that medium format. And just for example's sake, if I come in here and show you the raw images of these two and zoom in, this is the same exact image of what you were just looking at, just not the JPEG version, so there's no recipe applied. You can tell that the grain is gone, again, no recipe applied, and the image is much clearer. So just remember that looking at some of these JPEGs from the X100S is that there's a heavy amount of grain applied to the image. So if we go back in to our comparison, there's a lot more detail in the X100S image in terms of the city in the background. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to the medium format look, because most people associate that look with depth of field or shallow depth of field, which we're gonna talk about and get to in just a second. Let's also take a quick look at the full frame Nikon versus the medium format. So we got the Nikon on the left, medium format on the right. One is 24 megapixels, one is 102. So that's why you're seeing a difference of being zoomed in. But even on the full frame, it does a better job at getting the city in focus. So if I compare it to the Fujifilm X100S, you're gonna see that the Fujifilm still renders the city in more sharpness than even the full frame. And what's really important about this example is that I was trying to get the city in focus, and only one of the cameras really did that, whereas the full frame kind of did it and the medium format definitely did not do it. Now, does the medium format have the most detail and probably the most shadow recovery and all that stuff? Yes, but it did not do what I had intended with the image. And we're gonna talk about that in a little bit more, but I wanna show you a couple more images. All right, let's take a look at the next image, which is the same exact image just shot at f2.8 on all of the cameras. And we're gonna zoom into that same spot where I basically focused on this point of view wording here for these images. And you're gonna notice how out of focus the GFX image is compared to the X100S image at f2.8. I think a lot of people associate medium format with this look, with this creamy bokeh, this out of focus area, and just how nice it looks. And I have to admit that in this particular image, it looks really nice. And I think that that's part of the aesthetic that was going in those initial images. But if we also take a look at the Nikon image, which is full frame, I feel like the full frame does a pretty good job at rendering those out of focus areas in a really pleasing way, much better than the APS-C camera, or the X100S rather. But it really just depends on what you're trying to shoot, right? And I think that that's what's really important in this discussion, is that for all of the moments that medium format gets praised for having really nice out of focus areas, we don't really talk about it as much for getting everything in focus. I actually watched a video recently from my friend Mark Denny, and he got rid of, or is switching over, or switched back from medium format because he found himself having to focus stack more often than he would like on medium format because he wanted everything in focus and just couldn't do it the majority of the time. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's a bad thing, especially if you're like a portrait photographer and you're shooting things out of focus pretty much 99% of the time, maybe that's a good thing. Like, let's look at this final image here, where I got the closest to the subject, meaning obviously my plane of focus there, versus the out of focus areas in the background. Now, this was also taken at f2.8. Here is the Nikon image, here is the X100S image, and here is the GFX image. Now, something interesting here is that how shallow the depth of field is means that the point of view wording, which I focused on this particular spot where the little eyepiece is for each of these images, meant that the words point of view on the GFX image slightly out of focus. And if you look at it on the full frame, also slightly out of focus. But if you look at it on the APS-C, you can read the whole thing and it's not out of focus. Now, a lot of this comes down to the settings of your camera. If you're familiar with Equivalence, and you probably are if you've done anything photography related or watched even videos, but typically it's referred to for focal length. This is the times that everyone always says that, oh, it's 35mm equivalent when they're talking about APS-C cameras. So for example, on the X100S, it has a 23mm lens, which is the equivalent of a 35mm lens, because you have to do a multiplication of 1.5 times that because the sensor is smaller. Well, you have to do the same thing for medium format, it's just a smaller number than 1. So if I want the equivalence of a 35mm lens on full frame for medium format, then I have to use a 45mm medium format lens, meaning I would take 45mm times 0.79, which is its equivalence factor, and that would give me roughly a 35mm lens. And I apologize if you already know about equivalence, but we never talk about it when it comes to aperture, we only talk about it when it comes to focal length, but it applies to aperture. I'll give you an example. f2.2 on an APS-C lens is equivalent to f3.5 on a full frame lens, which is equivalent to f4.5 on a medium format sensor. I think I said lens before, but I meant sensor for all of them. That means that to get the same depth of field on medium format and APS-C, I gotta shoot APS-C at 2.2 and I gotta shoot medium format at 4.5. That's a really big difference, and also a much larger difference in terms of the amount of light being let in at those apertures. But Jordan and Chris did a really great video on this that you can find here a few years ago. They go into a direct comparison that basically proves that if you do that equivalence on full frame, medium format, or APS-C, you get the exact same depth of field. So there's not really any magic going on there. It's just that medium format captures a shallower depth of field at the same apertures. And you might be wondering why I didn't do that equivalence calculation here in this side-by-side comparison. And I think it's because that 95% of photographers basically just want to walk up and shoot a scene at the same aperture regardless of the size of the sensor they're on. They think that 2.8 on one sensor versus the other is going to give them something similar. And the finding is that usually when you're shooting on medium format, you're going to get way more shallow depth of field shooting at the other apertures that you were used to. So if you were a user of an APS-C camera and you shot at 2.8 and then you got a medium format camera and you shot at 2.8, you're going to be blown away by how much better the out of focus areas are than previously. Or you might be pissed off if you're a landscape photographer and you're like, all my stuff isn't in focus anymore and you got to relearn what apertures you need to shoot at to do so. So before I talk more about my thoughts on medium format, let's look at a few more images because that's what you're here for. Also, if you're interested, I have an entire article with these images in more detail and better resolution that you'll be able to find in the link below. I'm even going to include a few RAWs that you can download yourself from straight out of camera or the JPEGs, so you can really pixel peep and get an idea for them yourself as well. That'll be linked down below. Now again, there's no Nikon ZF in this comparison, but we do get a more apples to apple comparison of the X100S versus the GFX. And especially when we're zoomed out here, I think that the images are very similar. One thing you're going to notice is that yes, this area is blown out in the highlights on the X100S image. And if I go into the RAW, yes, you can definitely recover more of the data in the medium format camera. Honestly, that's to be expected. I've already disclaimed that it is the better sensor for all technical reasons. And if I zoom in here, you're going to notice that there's more detail in the water. You're also going to notice that the grain is very thick on the X100S image. And you might be sitting here saying, oh, well, the cleaner image is on the right for the GFX. And you would be correct. But just remember that the image coming out of the X100S is actually pretty clean. It's just that the grain is a lot stronger in its recipe than the GFX version is. But once we zoom out and look at these side by side, the things I'm looking for is that these images look very close for me in terms of how they look and feel. It's all about the vibe. Nope, I'm not saying that word again. I just like the aesthetics of both of the images pretty similarly, and it also means that maybe I don't have to go out and drop $7,000 on another camera. But let's just take a look. I'm not going to do the side by side. I just want to zoom into these. This is the X100S image, and this is the GFX image. And one thing you're going to notice between these two is that I tried to focus on the same spot, which is just the center right here, which is actually further away from me than the top part of this flower. And you're going to see that, and that the detail in the center here is great on the GFX. But again, shooting at f8, I believe, on both of these images, let me confirm that. Yep, f8 on both of these images, you're going to notice how much is out of focus on the GFX. This part's in focus here, we go down here, this part's kind of in focus, and then we lose it. Whereas when we're looking at the X100S image, because it's that crop, we actually have a lot more detail down here in the flower. And I think, again, I will reiterate, this is important because there are many times out there that you just want to take one image and maybe you only have a certain amount of light in terms of the aperture, and you need to shoot at something lower than f11. Sorry, I guess it's technically higher than f11. So let's say you're forced to shoot at f8. You're going to be able to get more in focus on an APS-C camera or a full frame camera than you would in medium format. So it really depends on what you shoot. And I'm not trying to be a medium format hater here. I just want to make sure that people understand that there is a cost to medium format. That isn't just in the wallet. It's that you are going to have way less in focus at the same apertures you're used to. And for this last image, there's no direct light. There's a much more even light. And I'm not going to zoom into any of this part because I really just want to talk about the colors, how it's rendering the highlight areas, and just the overall feel of the image is very similar between these two. Maybe the GFX is a slight bit warmer. Obviously, the size of the image on the top and the bottom, because it shoots 4:3 rather than 2:3, is a little bit bigger. But for the most part, these images give off the same feeling to me. And if we go back to these two images as well, I would say these are pretty dang close in terms of how they look and how they feel, in terms of the colors, in terms of the shadow areas, and that the GFX versus the X100S II in this case looks very similar. Speaking of taking images on bright sunny days out in the mountains, this is a perfect time to talk about this portable solar panel that Renogy sent me to sponsor today's video. If you don't know who Renogy is, that's okay. But if you've ever dabbled into van life, overlanding, or living on the road like I have for the past several years, you'll know that their name is one of the leading brands in power solutions for nomadic life. You don't need to know any of that to benefit from this lightweight, portable 30-watt solar panel. It comes equipped with a 20-watt USB-C port and an 18-watt USB-A port to charge things like your phone, or better yet, your camera, anywhere you can find sunshine. It's foldable, portable, weather-resistant, and barely over 1 pound. It's great for day hikes, overnight adventures, road trips, van life, beaches, pretty much any outdoor activity. And best of all, it's highly affordable and just good to have around for when you need it. Check out more of its features with my link in the description and grab one today. Thanks again to Renogy for sponsoring this video. Okay, and really quick, let's take a look at some of the RAWs because I know there's people watching probably interested in seeing those rather than seeing the JPEG recipes. Remember, these are using the classic chrome that comes from Fujifilm, so they're not necessarily straight out of camera, but they are kind of straight out of camera. I don't know, I'll leave that up for you. But on the left is the X100S II, on the right is the GFX100S, and you can see that there's definitely a bit more of a red cast on the Fujifilm, I almost said Fujifilm, on the X100S II. But all the grain is gone here for this image, and actually if you want to take a look at what came straight out of camera, we could do that really quick with these two. So X100S II on the left, GFX100S on the right, and this is just with the white balances being not the same. So again, more green and blue on the left, a little bit more warm and magenta on the right. But for the most part, the looks of these particular images is really close. Like if we take out the recipes, I think I already set these to be the correct white balance. Let's take a look. Yeah, so both of these are set to the same white balance. And for me, outside of the out of focus areas, the look and feel of the image is very similar. Again, the city on the GFX image, definitely more out of focus. And the depth of field on the GFX image is way shallower. And that brings me to my conclusion on medium format, which is it magical? And I think in some ways it feels magical, but I don't think it is. After doing this comparison and seeing the results of the images, I could tell that the colors and the rendition of the image outside of the out of focus areas is very similar on all three cameras, and that if I had walked up to that scene with any of the cameras I had, I would probably get very similar images. What is special about medium format, or what might make it magical, is that on average, it's just higher quality across the board. That's the thing, is that the lens that I'm using on the GFX100S, which is the 45mm GF 2.8, cost the same or more than both of the other cameras by themselves. And I think that that's something really specific to remember, is that a lot of the times you have the highest quality lenses on the highest quality sensor, and you're just getting absolutely beautiful, detailed images because you're using the best of the best, because that's all that exists in the medium format world. The lenses for the Hasselblad are almost $3,000 each for primes. There's no zoom going on. This prime is almost $2,000. No zoom going on. And those prices, if you spent that much money on a lens for a full frame camera, for example, you would get very similar results as long as you're doing that equivalence in the aperture. And I think that that's what it really comes down to, is that the world of medium format is just the best of the best. And there is no, budget options. Sure, there's some third-party lenses that I have no experience with on medium format, But for the most part, you're combining the most detailed, highest spec sensor you can with very expensive, pristine, sharp, beautiful glass. That means you're gonna render out of focus areas better than, let's say, a $400 lens. That's just the result of spending more money, not necessarily medium format as a sensor. And the biggest thing, as I've already brought home to you, is that no one is doing equivalence calculations for the aperture. Most people are expecting to walk up and shoot something at the aperture they know, and they're just getting more shallow depth of field in the results that they have with the medium format that they're used to. They're not bumping up the aperture to match what they used to match. No, they're just shooting shots at 2.8 and really enjoying the way they look, because the cost of the camera, the cost of the lens in that out of focus area at that aperture at medium format is just more pleasing to the eye. That's the results I found. I would love to know what you think down in the comments below, or if this was just completely off the rails and didn't provide any feedback to you. Like I said, all the recipes and the article for this, if you want to download some of those RAWs, will be linked down below. I appreciate you watching and tuning in to me yapping about the differences of these sensor sizes. And there's got to be room out there somewhere. We just got to go find them. Thanks for being here. I'll see you on the next one. Later.